gone on to other things, said to me, well, you're doing well, wouldn't you like to form a company and bring us all in? And so we did, and we called it the White House Writers Group. We've been going now since 1993, and our clients are all over the world. Some of our biggest clients are in Europe, and we are, when we do political work, it's for presidential, Republican nominees for president. So that's our company. We do probably the thing that's for today's purposes most appropriate to note about our company is that we don't just take anyone. We're basically standing for the same things we did in the years in the White House. We're still for lower taxes, for limited government, meaning less intrusive regulation. We're for strong national defense, strong relations with our friends and allies, the United States' friends and allies around the world, and our client list reflects that. So that's us. But we're not here today to talk about the White House Writers Group. This is the anniversary of the Tear Down This Wall speech, the signature speech of the Reagan era. There were many great speeches in that period, and I'm not going to talk about my own, but I'd say that for example, the President's Westminster speech in June '82, which was given to the British Parliament, and the President wrote a fair amount of that himself, but the speechwriter involved was a fellow named Tony Dolan. There was a speech in, there were many speeches in Moscow during the 1988 summit. The one that gets the most acclaim was to students at Moscow State University, in which the President talked about the promise of a free future, and that was written along with the President by a speechwriter named Josh Gilder. By the way, the Westminster speech talked about communism. That was 1982, ending up on the ash heap of history. But the speech that's most widely remembered and most widely quoted, of course, is the President's Berlin Wall speech, in which he called on Mr. Gorbachev to tear down that wall. Now, there's a big story, it's been often told, but Andreas has asked me to tell it to you, of how that line came to be in the speech. The speechwriter was a fellow named Peter Robinson, and he's now at the Hoover Institution in Palo Alto, California, part of Stanford University. And in fact, he's host of an online TV program called Uncommon Knowledge, which you can pick up via the web. It's also put on National Review Online. It's also on the Hoover website. And I happen to know that its audience equals that of many cable television, exceeds that of many cable television shows in the United States. Peter's written a number of books. He's had an illustrious career. He was pretty young at the time. He graduated from Dartmouth and then Oxford, come to the White House, followed the same path I did, first to the Vice President, then to the President. He had joined the White House staff in about '82. So he was asked to do the Berlin Wall speech, the speech of the President in Berlin in '87. Now, the speech was to come, the visit of the President to the Berlin, which was his second visit, he had visited also in '82, was to come right after the economic summit in Venice that year. But this speech, everyone recognized, was to be an important speech, a critical speech. The Soviet Union relations had changed considerably. You'll recall there were riots in Berlin in '82 when the President had visited. That was also true when the Vice President visited around that time. And there was tremendous conflict over our policy, which was essentially to force to stand up to the Soviets, to build up our armaments, and ultimately, as it turned out, to negotiate once we were in a position of strength and they were willing to negotiate. They had put in place a very dangerous weapons that would deeply unsettle the balance that had prevailed in those years. It was understood that you did not put weapons in Europe that could only fire to Europe because of nuclear strategy issues. That was deeply unbalancing. They'd done that. We were moving to respond. There were great there was great resistance in some elements in Europe. We stood firm. The European nations stood firm. The decision was made to ultimately, after a series of elections that started in '83, went through to '84 and '85 in Canada, Germany, the UK, and of course in the United States. And when the people of those countries reaffirmed that they were standing behind the leaders who were for these policies, the Soviets came to the table. And the president, in a private meeting some months later in '86, was asked, did he think the Cold War was over and that the Soviets were essentially trying to come to an accommodation that basically reflected that they thought they had lost it. And he said privately, yes. So there'd been a great deal of turmoil in the years before this speech. This speech was one of several in which the president laid down areas in which the Soviets could act to show that they were serious about opening up their own country, about more democratic institutions in their own country, about greater freedom in their own country, and about backing away from an imperial stance towards Europe and other parts of the world, backing away from attempting to develop a hegemony over Europe. Peter was sent to, whenever a president goes to speak, there are two trips that precede him. One is called a pre-advance, which is a broad planning trip. Where will he speak? What will be the what will he stand in front of? What will be the stage setting, if you will, of the speech? Where will the meetings be? What will the routes for the motorcades be? And then there's an advance trip in which a team goes in and puts together if there are stands needed for the press, they get built. If there are podiums needed, they see that they're there. All the stage settings of a presidential or visit are done by the advance team, as well as working out, for example, with, if it were to Stockholm, with the Prime Minister's staff, who stays where will they meet, and that sort of thing, what should be in the room, and all those kinds of issues. Well, Peter, it's not common for the presidential speechwriter to be sent on either of these trips. It happened occasionally, but it wasn't common. In this case, Peter was asked to go on the pre-advance. It was understood that this was going to be a big speech, and the speechwriter should see the settings, have a sense of where we were going to be and the president was going to be, where he was going to be speaking. Peter was a graduate of Oxford, Dartmouth then Oxford. And he was, so he had a number of friends in Berlin from his Oxford years. But his first stop in Berlin was to the senior American diplomat in Berlin. Now, I won't say this man's name, but his first advice to Peter was never to mention the wall. In the president's speech, do not mention the Berlin Wall. Europeans saw it, the president, as a cowboy. This was seen as provocative, talking about the wall. It shouldn't be mentioned. By the way, that man later said that he wrote the speech. This is the way our things work in the United States. Maybe they work in Stockholm that way too, but in Washington they work that way. But he said but in any event, that evening, one of Peter's friends had prevailed upon a woman in Berlin to put together, one of Peter's Oxford friends, to put together a dinner party. And at the dinner party were people like you would find in any of your constituencies, lawyers, doctors, business people, people from all walks of life, professors and people that were friends of this woman. And as the evening got going, Peter recounted what the American diplomat had told him, and he said, "Is that true? Should I not mention speech, the wall, in the president's speech? Should it not be mentioned?" There was a silence in the room. And then one man spoke up and said, "My sister lives 25 miles to the east. I haven't seen her since the wall went up. What do you think I think about the wall?" The diplomat said people no longer cared about the wall. They were accustomed to it. Another man said, "Every day I go to work and I pass a guard tower and I see a young man standing in that guard tower with an AK-47, Soviet standard issue rifle, automatic rifle. And I think this is a zoo, but I'm not sure who's the zookeeper and who's the animal." And finally, the hostess of the evening said, "If Mr. Gorbachev is serious about glasnost and perestroika, which you'll recall were his terms for openness and for democratization in the Soviet Union, if he is serious in restructuring, if he is serious about that, he will come to Berlin and he'll tear down the wall." So Peter took those thoughts back with him to Washington, and he started writing. And when he had a draft, and Tony Dolan had gone over it and some others, when the draft was ready, but it was primarily Peter's work. And when the draft was ready, it was entirely Peter's work with editing from others. When the draft was ready, it went into staffing. Now, in the White House, you don't just hand a speech to the president and say, "Here it is, sir, go to it." Instead, it goes through a formal process where a staff secretary for the White House takes the speech and has copies of it sent to those parts of the government that have a direct policy interest in the speech. In this case, obviously, the National Security Council and the State Department. And then within state, there's a staffing process which would go to the Soviet office, might go to some other subject area offices. Then comments come back. And the comments came back, and State Department wanted the line out, "Tear down this wall." Well, what ensued was a number of weeks. I should back up and tell you that in this particular case, something unusual happened. I've described the staffing process, and you'll notice I didn't describe, in fact, I told you the president, you don't normally give the speech initially to the president. That wasn't the case, in fact, in this instance. The president got the speech, the staff secretary, the communications director gave the president the speech in advance of it going into staffing. And there was a meeting in the White House of speechwriters with the president. A number of speeches were discussed in that meeting. And the president, they got to the, I was in the meeting, they got to this speech, and the Berlin Wall speech, and Peter explained that, as it says in the speech, it describes that with radio conditions right, it could be heard all through Eastern Europe, it might be heard as far east as Moscow, there would be a large audience. Was there anything the president had to say about the speech? And the president thought for a moment, and he said, "Well, that line about the wall, it should stay." And so with that line, by the way, the speechwriters and and those in the room, the staff secretary, the communications director, probably the chief of staff, were the only ones who knew that the president had said that. It went into staffing. By the way, I also said that it was given to the president by the staff secretary. That would be the normal process. Someone else may have given it to him, but it was clear that the president had seen it, wanted to see it. I had other instances dealing with the Soviets where the president saw the speech in advance. This was rare, but it generally dealt in areas where the president was directly involved. And so the speech was in making policy and in the nuts and bolts of policy, which he was as the principal, as really our principal negotiator. So the speech went into staffing. And the State Department came back and said, take out that line. They came back with a whole new draft, and the critical part of that draft was the line was out. Over the next few weeks, there was tremendous fighting back and forth with an attempt to accommodate state in whatever areas they could. And you'll notice if you read the entire speech that after the tear down this wall line, there comes a section in which specific diplomatic initiatives are discussed. And that was an attempt to, that's first taking care of business. It was not unusual for us to do that in presidential speeches, but it was also part of accommodating state, making sure they were happy about that, and but continually saying no to them on taking out the line, tear down this wall. It got to a point where where Secretary of State Schultz appealed to the president on behalf of the State Department and on behalf of people in the State Department, and saying, take it out. The president said no. Whenever it came to him, he said no. Our job, the speechwriting job, was to fight that as often, knock as many of these down as possible, but of course, some got directly to the president. Just before they went into to Berlin, in the palace in Venice, where the president was staying during the economic summit of that year. It was I think at that time the G7, now it's the G7000. But in that year, the Chief of Staff, Ken Duberstein, came to the president, and the president was working on papers, and he said, Mr. President, state has come back again. This is the day before the speech is given. State has come back again, and they want the line out. And the president said looked up at Ken. He was sitting in a chair. Ken was standing over him, and he said, well, Ken, by the way, I'm imitating the president. You're welcome to laugh if you hear this. I can't tell on the screen if you are. But he said, well, Ken, I am the president, aren't I? And Ken said, yes, sir. Yes, you are. And that does mean I get to make these decisions, doesn't it? Yes, sir. Everybody agrees about that. Well, then, it stays. And in the limousine, going to the event, going to the Brandenburg Gate, he slapped Ken on the knee and he said, the boys at state are going to kill me for this, but it's the right thing to do. And that's how that line got into the speech. Now, Andreas has asked me to talk a bit about the philosophy behind it, and I'd urge you to read the speech because a great deal of the material, the text leading up to the line to the call on Mr. Gorbachev is a discussion of freedom, and a discussion of freedom, what freedom means to people, that freedom in the arts, you can't have arts flourish without freedom, that you can't have economies without artistic freedom, you can't have economies flourish without economic freedom. It is a discussion of the philosophy underpinning the division between East and West at that time, and the philosophy of freedom, which characterized Mr. Reagan's career as a public man from the very first time he stepped on the stage as a public man. He in Hollywood, he had fought the communists who wanted to take over the actors union and some of the other unions. In his first steps as a public man running for governor of, supporting a candidate for the unsuccessful candidacy of Barry Goldwater for the presidency, he gave a speech that talked about the promise of freedom, about the need to stand for freedom. This was the heart of Ronald Reagan's career, and it culminated, its highest moment was in calling for Mr. Gorbachev to tear down this wall. But it permeated his economic policies, it permeated his standing for courts that were strict about the rule of law, it permeated every part as championing of free and open trade, of strong relations with our friends and allies. It permeated everything he did throughout his public career. And as I say, when he spoke those words, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, it was a call for the blessings of freedom to be extended to people all over the world who didn't have them at that time. Well, that's my story, and on this anniversary of the delivery of that speech, and Andreas has told me you may have some questions, so Andreas, it's your floor now.
Thank you so much. I think we should give Clark a round of applause. Thank you so much for this very interesting account of the story behind the speech. If I may start the questioning, how would you say that this story behind the speech reflects the leadership or the style of leadership that President Reagan had in his dealings with the State Department and in his decision to keep the line?
Well, it was very reflective of the president's leadership style. You'll notice that he gave lots of room for others to have their say, and he gave a lot of room to the speechwriters to do their work. And in that way, we were working within a framework that he had developed, he had laid out throughout his career, and we knew that framework. That's why we were there, because we believed in it. You see him giving lots of room, but also setting limits by saying that line will stay. But he left it up to us to do. Remember, a lot of the government didn't know that he'd said that. He left it up to us to do a great deal of the fighting on that, and there was tremendous fighting, and to accommodate the other parts of the government as much as we could without violating that one instruction. And you see him setting up a dynamic so that as many people are as included as possible. And then you see when the critical issue comes to him, he stands completely firm. And that critical issue follows from what he has said throughout his career. It follows from the logic of the event. It follows from everything we found, Peter found and Peter Robinson found in Berlin. It reflects a sense of what is right and wrong about humanity and about freedom. And all of that you see, and he stands completely firm on that core issue and lets all the storms swirl around, but the ship never wavers from that course. That was the leadership style of Ronald Reagan.
Thank you very much. Are there other questions? Christian Holm, please.
Well, thank you very much.
Wave your hand. Wait a second. Would you wave your hand so that the fellow here, whenever somebody asks a question, the fellow here can zoom in on you and I can see you a little more clearly.
Sure. Thank you very much, Mr. Judge, for this opportunity. And my name is Christian Holm, a member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs in the Swedish Parliament. I must admit that I don't remember 1987 when Mr. Reagan had the speech. I was by that time 10 years old. But I belong to the people who have been numerous times at the different museums in Berlin, and of course have followed everything on YouTube and television afterwards. It was, of course, one of the greatest speeches. And if you would see today in international politics and in international diplomacy, because I think we don't have Soviet Union, but we have many countries where the situation is sort of where the freedom is restricted in the same way. And we have seen today, even in Russia, when it's in the news that Putin is closing down several medias and so. If you would compare the international policy of Mr. Reagan with the world leaders today, of course it's another era of time which has to be reflected. But what would you say, is there something that you can sort of miss today in international politics and in the political debate?
I would say, by the way, it's a little awkward doing this by television hookup. So had I been in the room, I would have naturally said to everyone how honored I am to be speaking to all of you, members of the Parliament and a group this important and this with the principles you have. And thank you for having me. Now, to answer your question, I think what we brought that was extraordinary, or that Mr. Reagan brought that was extraordinary, was a moral sense combined with a very astute sense of global politics, and a sense of humanity, touching the theme of freedom. The theme was really about not what characterizes American, but what characterizes people all over the world. And he spoke to it not in an aggressive sense, but in a sense of validating what people were feeling and believing and wanting all over the world. And so constantly he was placing himself and placing all he did in terms of responding to the greater desires of people in that time, in particular in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. But remember, we also had democratic revolutions in the Philippines at that time. We had tremendous democratic upheavals in Latin America, and South Africa and other places, and sometimes overtly and sometimes behind the scenes, but in all cases we were supporting the movement towards democratic and free societies. And so that moral leadership, that clarity, but also the sophistication in moving in that direction, those sorts of, that mixture of idealism and realism has, I think, been, if not lost, the focus isn't quite there anymore. The ability to balance both the aspirations of people in the moment in a way that moves the moment forward, that towards greater freedom, I think we could use more of in the world. In his inaugural address as a public man, the one I mentioned in the 1964 presidential campaign, President Reagan, the future president, said the goal was not left or right, but up or down to the maximum of personal freedom consistent with public order, or down towards the swamp of totalitarianism. That sense, that clarity, I think we could have a lot more of. and the world would be better off for it. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much. And maybe my welcoming you to the Swedish Parliament was a bit short as well. We are, of course, likewise honored to have you here in the Swedish Parliament telling us about President Reagan. Are there other questions from my colleagues here? Please.
Hello, my name is Claes Verschell. I work for the Moderate Party here in the Parliament. Thank you very much for a very interesting and elaborative discussion about President Reagan and the speech. I was wondering about after he held the speech, what was President Reagan's reaction to the impact of the speech, and how did the discussion between you and President Reagan? How was it, so to say, after the speech? Thank you.
Well, remember that much of the global press was very skeptical of us and not entirely friendly towards us. And so the speech's power, the speech's power was first of all with the Soviets. The Soviets at that time were listening very carefully to what we were saying. And you see this in later Reagan speeches where he lays down ways for the Soviets to normalize relations with the West. The Soviets there were tremendous forces in the Soviet Union at the time, and every time we at play, and they were, as much as they were for and against normalization, the forces that Mr. Gorbachev represented, which were for normalization, for a normal country, as they said, which would ultimately lead to a dismantling of the empire and opening up. It's perfectly right, they're backtracking now, but they're nowhere near where they were, and the horrible place they were. All of that was in play, and so I think that and I've actually forgotten your question. Would you repeat that again?
Sure. I was asking about I'm here. Yes. The discussions between you and President Reagan, or President Reagan's what President Reagan thought about the speech after giving it, and the reactions that came from the world, so to speak.
Okay. Sorry about that. The reaction, first of all, from the Soviets was we knew that they were making note, and we knew that we had scored in terms of how they were thinking. We were basically saying, think about a post-Soviet world, and we were starting to see that they were responding to that. But at the same time, in the global press, there was skepticism, there was a kind of big yawn, the daily headlines. It wasn't until later, when the wall actually came down, when Eastern Europe started to open up, when the Soviet Union started to crumble, that the importance of the speech was widely recognized. Among our closest allies, it was well received. Within the United States, it was well received. But the critical question of the Soviets understanding that there was a post-Soviet world coming, that was not understood up until that post-Soviet world came. We understood it within the White House and within the circle around Mr. Reagan, but it took several years before others did.
Thank you. Edward Riedel.
Yes, Edward Riedel.
Wave your hand.
Yes, I'm waving here.
Okay.
Member of Parliament for the Conservative Party. And thank you for sharing this story with us today. Very interesting to listen to you. But if you should mention another speech, perhaps written by another person that had the same impact like the Berlin Wall speech, could you name such a speech after this one?
For President Reagan, I would say the Moscow State University speech during the 1988 Moscow summit was, at that time, actually until the Berlin Wall came down, many people thought of that as the signature speech of the Reagan presidency. Earlier, you'll recall the speech I mentioned earlier to the British Parliament in June 1982, the Westminster speech, Communism on the Ash Heap of History. That was, for a period, seen as a signature speech and a defining speech. The Evil Empire speech, obviously that phrase for a long time during the Reagan presidency defined the way at least the press talked about American policy. But I would say after the 1987 Berlin Wall speech, the next big speech on freedom and a post-Soviet world, there were a series of speeches around the 1988 summit, and the one that's most noted would be the Moscow State University speech. He also gave a speech in Helsinki, he gave a speech in London, he gave a number of speeches at artists and writers in Moscow, Stavo House, Monastery, each of these talking about artistic, religious, political freedom. That cluster of speeches, but particularly Moscow State University, those are the next big moments articulating the vision of a post-Soviet world.
Thank you.
Also,
Thank you.
Also by the way, in those speeches, laying out some more of what we were looking for in a post-Soviet world, what it would look like. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm here.
Hi.
My name is Jonas Jakobsson Görtler. I'm a member of parliament for the Moderate Party. President Reagan is, of course, very famous. His speeches are very famous, and we all know that presidents have speech writers, of course. But how much would you say that Mr. Reagan gave input to his speeches, this one or other ones? Did he get you described that he got a finished, more or less finished speech, but did he give any input before that?
If you look at the speaking Ronald Reagan did before the presidency and the extemporaneous speaking during the presidency, what you'll see is that each of the speeches we speechwriters wrote reflected all the thinking and the values, the insights that he articulated in those when he was writing on his own, his radio addresses, his private letters, some of which we were privy to, some of which we weren't. We certainly knew his writings and speaking before the presidency, public speaking before the presidency. I was asked earlier about President Reagan's about his leadership style. Part of his leadership style, part that was possible for him and is not nearly as available to other political leaders often, was that he had so clearly defined what he was for and the thinking behind what he was for before he got to the presidency. And he continued to do it when he had opportunities, both in private meetings and in extemporaneous speaking. He continued to do it through his presidency. So, whereas other political leaders might need to work in detail with their speechwriters, President Reagan didn't need to nearly so much. We knew where he was going. We knew what he was standing for. We knew what his basic principles were and his thinking about how those principles were playing out in the world at that time. all of this we knew without talking to him. One of his closest foreign policy advisors was a fellow whose name was William Clark. He was known as, in the White House, as he had been on the bench in California before he came to Washington, and he was known in the White House therefore as Judge Clark, which got us mixed up occasionally. But in his memoirs, he says that, in fact, he rarely spoke at length with the president. They spoke almost in a shorthand. They knew each other so well, and they knew what they were about so well. Well, that was the same with the speechwriters, too. Our relationship wasn't quite as intimate, although one of the speechwriters, who is now in Congress, had known the president from his president's first moments in public life. But his name is Dana Rohrabacher. But we knew where he wanted to go. And so while there are speeches, major speeches, I've mentioned several times now the Westminster speech in the British Parliament in June '82. That speech was large sections of it. I've seen the president's handwritten drafts. Large sections of it where he wrote himself. When he returned from from Reykjavik after the flash summit, if you will, that with Mr. Gorbachev, in which Mr. Gorbachev, this was much later, of course, when Mr. Gorbachev asked him to give up the Strategic Defense Initiative and said he'd give in on a lot of other things, which he later gave in on, arms issues, and the president said no. He wrote large sections of the speech that he gave on the evening he returned to Washington, gave on national television himself. He was writing right up until the moment before he got on the camera. People were typing it furiously into the teleprompter. So it's not that he didn't write himself, but much of what we did not require a great deal of input from him for this very reason. He had been so clear and so precise and so firm about setting the parameters for what he would accept and wouldn't accept, and setting the goals to which he wanted to lead the country and the world.
Thank you. Other questions? I have one myself, actually. I'm in the middle of reading Margaret Thatcher's memoirs right now, and she writes a lot about President Reagan, of course. Among other things, she writes that lesser men were likely to underestimate him. There was, of course, in Europe a sense of some doubts about President Reagan when he was first elected, and I believe also in the United States. But my impression is that the attitudes towards President Reagan has changed considerably in the United States in the later years, in the later decades, and perhaps also in Europe. Could you tell us a little bit about how President Reagan is now seen in the United States?
Well, I would say he's the single most popular political figure in the country right now. He's seen as the standard, certainly Republicans see him as the standard for what a president should be like, and for the sense of purpose, for the direction, and a large part of the country feels the same way. Obviously, the opposition party in this country, the Democratic Party, by and large, its leaders do not feel that way. But the force of public opinion is so strong that they nevertheless have to acknowledge him. I would say also that isn't uniform within the Democratic Party, but those elements that are most dominant now, it's very much so. It's too bad they don't recognize the force of President Reagan in history, but that's politics. You may have a little of that in Sweden, too.
we might have a little touch of